it's Jennifer with 4-H Capital, and today we're going to be learning about the water cycle by trying to make it rain in a jar. So in order to show you what the water cycle looks like, on paper, I've drawn this water cycle diagram. We'll start with evaporation. Can you repeat that? Evaporation. That's when the heat in the air pulls water up to the sky and forms clouds. An example of evaporation is when you see a puddle on the ground drying. That water is evaporating. That water goes into the air in the clouds and forms water vapor, which is gas. And this can happen with more than puddles. It can even happen with lakes, ponds, rivers, or really any water source. The next part of the cycle is condensation. Can you repeat that? Condensation. That is when the water that has been evaporated now collects in the sky as clouds. After condensation comes precipitation. Can you repeat that? Precipitation. The water vapor in the sky has now cooled and is now liquid again. Because liquid is heavier than gas or air, gravity pulls that water back to Earth, which is when it rains. This water falls back down as rain into lakes and ponds and makes the world wet, again forming puddles. After it rains, the water is again evaporated and the cycle continues. Can you list the 3 different steps of the water cycle? Awesome! Evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Now that you have some background knowledge about the water cycle, let's get started with the activity. We're going to demonstrate the different steps of the water cycle by making it rain inside a jar. To do this activity, you're going to need 1 jar, and you can use any jar that you have, a ceramic plate, and this one is a little too big, but this will work too, just as long as the bottom is flat, so you're able to cover the top of the jar. And you're going to need some hot water, and I just have my hot water in a little container like this, and some ice, which I will get later, but I just don't want it to melt right now. Make sure that you're careful with this one. Have an adult help you, or you don't want to burn yourself. So first, we're going to pour the hot water into our jar. You want to fill it, whatever jar you're using, maybe like 1/3 of the way. So I'm just gonna pour it. And that's about 1/3. You don't need to make it exact, just as long as you can see the steam coming out. Now put your ceramic plate on top of the jar and make sure you get that steam trapped in, and we're just gonna wait for a minute. And so while we're waiting, we can think about why there has to be steam. What part of the water cycle is the steam supposed to represent? Evaporation, condensation, or precipitation? I won't tell you the answer now, but we'll go over it in the end. But for now, just think about it. Or if you're working with someone, turn to them and discuss what you think. Now that the minute is about over, we're going to place the ice right on top of our plate. So right now, without the ice, it looks like this. And you can kind of see that it's already starting to condense. But we're gonna put the ice right on top of the plate, on top of the opening of the jar. And you should see that the ice is starting to melt on top. But keep an eye out for what happens inside the jar. What do you notice? And so we can just wait. And you can start seeing that these water droplets get a lot bigger, and you can see them kind of just like forming, and you can already see that this one on the side just fell down. Let's keep waiting. You can see that more and more drops are starting to fall. And the water droplets are getting bigger and bigger, and so because they're getting bigger and they're combining together, they're getting heavier and falling. And even though the water might not fall directly from the plate, it still kind of looks like it is raining because it looks like more and more water is being added onto the sides of the glass. And it's true that there is water being added because the steam that was from the hot water to begin with is now hitting the top of the plate and cooling down so that it's now forming these little pockets of water that are attaching to each other and then rolling down the sides. And this might take a little while, but just wait and see, and you'll see more and more water starting to fall. So a lot of this demonstration is just waiting and observing to see what happens. So I will let you observe your own jar while you're looking at this and watching to see what happens. Think about what parts of the water cycle you can see here. Do you see evaporation, condensation, precipitation? Do you see all three? That activity was super easy, but also demonstrated not only a lot about the water cycle, but also about the different states of water. And some of you may have already learned about the different states of water, but if not, we're going to go over a little bit about it now. So water has 3 states of matter, and those are liquid state, solid state, and gas state. So an example of a solid water is like ice, and an example of a liquid water is just normal water, like the one that you and I both drink. An example of the gas state of water is steam. And so that's basically water that is in the air, but even so, it's still water, and it can blend into the air and float. And this activity mainly focused on the gas and liquid states of water. Before I explain what happened, let's reflect on some questions and think about your answers to these questions, and if you can, discuss them with someone that you're working with. And if you're not working with anyone, you can just think about them. So the first question I want you to ask yourself or discuss with someone else is, how did the ice on top help make the water droplets? And why do you think that the water droplets fell or started rolling down the side? The second question is, what does the sky look like or the air feel like when it's raining or before it starts to rain? Can you tell when it'll rain without looking it up? The third question is, why do you think we put ice on top of the plate over the water and not just directly into the water? Now that we got our gears going about the water cycle, let's go back and review it. We have evaporation, which was which part of the demonstration in the jar? You can pause here if you want to answer out loud. Exactly. When you first put the hot water in and then covered the top, the steam that you saw was evaporation. Then we have condensation, which is which part? Right. It was when you saw the water droplets begin to form, but before they started to roll down and fall back into the water. This could have happened even before you put the ice cubes on the jar, because since your plate was cold, the second that the steam hit the cold plate, it could have started condensing, and then this process got sped up when you put the ice cubes on top of the plate. And once the steam hit the cool surface, the water or the steam cooled down the evaporated water and changed it back into liquid. The next part of the cycle is what? Precipitation. And which part was that from our water cycle in a jar? Exactly. Precipitation was when the water droplets started to fall back down into the jar, much like how rain starts to fall back onto Earth. So we can relate this experiment back to rain, because rain is just water from Earth that has been evaporated and then turned into clouds. And then when it starts to get a little bit colder or just too much water is up there, it is too heavy for the water to stay floating in the air. So the water comes falling down just like it did in the jar. Which is why usually when it's super cloudy outside, many people say, look, I think it's about to rain. When there are a lot of clouds in the sky, it usually can mean that there's a lot of water in the sky waiting to fall back down as rain. So what's very important to remember is that weather is very complex and requires way more than the water cycle to explain. There are hot days, cold days, snowy days, on top of the rainy days, and even with the rainy days, there are cold rainy days and hot rainy days, and not all of these can be explained by the water cycle. But even so, don't be afraid to start thinking about the different types of days that you've seen or experienced and try to find ways to explain them as well. But now, every time it rains, I hope you'll think a little bit about this activity and what you've learned today. Hope you had fun.